Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be another video request that I've had for debunking or looking at the video Marxism 101, How Capitalism is Killing Itself with Dr. Richard Wolff. Now, just as a aside, I don't know, I've watched many videos by Richard Wolff. He's, kind of one of the, I would say, the most famous professors on Marxism, and he's an economist. Well, he acts like he's an economist, uh, and he's very well spoken in terms of telling people about communism. And a lot of the stuff that he says, from a certain perspective, you can sort of agree with. There's a lot of things that sound good. And I kind of want that to be understood that I'm not coming in here with any malice to him. I'm only going to be looking at the refutations to what he is saying, that really what he's saying doesn't necessarily hold true. And there's counter arguments to his points. So I'm going to play his video and I'm going to just comment as I watch it and give you my raw feedback to some of the things that he says. And hopefully, hopefully YouTube won't block this video, because they've been having a tendency of blocking my videos. So hopefully they won't do it this time. I'm going to put fair use stuff in the footer, in the into the description. So Google, please, I'm trying to use this fairly. YouTube, please, I'm trying to use this fairly. So yeah, let's watch his video. Here's his video right here. I'm gonna turn it on right now, and we can watch together.
Who's been teaching students and the public about Marxism for years, Dr. Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst.
You're a Marxist economist. Let's start from the basics. What is Marxism, and what does it mean to have a Marxist lens with which to view the world?
I think the best way to understand it is that the difference between Marxism and other things is that it wants to go to the root. It is radical in that sense. It wants to see these problems: homelessness, inequality, an economy that bounces around, having a recession or a depression every 3 to 7 years, a society that concentrates political power in a tiny number. These recurring problems of capitalism, Marxism says, are built into the system. And if you want to solve them,
Okay, so I just want to, I should have let him finish that sentence, but I just want to comment on a couple things here. A couple of the issues that he sees with capitalism, and this is a recurring theme. If you watch his videos, you'll see this kind of recurring theme with a lot of the stuff that he says. He talks about kind of two major issues, and there's actually others that he mentions, but two major ones that he talks about. He talks about the centralization of power, and he also talks about the constant crash within the capitalist system. So within a capitalist, is every so often there's like a slowdown. There's a crash that'll happen, like 2008. We can think of the great stock market crash in the 1920s. We can think of all those things as being failures of capitalism. That's the way he'll kind of present it. And I'm going to give you the counter to that, but I just want you to be aware that these are two reoccurring themes within everything that he says. He'll talk about how there's a centralization of power, and that there's this basically crash cycle of capitalism. Now, I really do want to address the first one of those 2 points before I let the video play too much more. The big thing is with the centralization of power. What people don't understand about capitalism, and this is one of those reoccurring themes, and the whole COVID situation that we're experiencing right now really illustrates this kind of theme. Where we see, oh, look at these companies like Amazon, Walmart, Google, Apple, all these big companies have actually, during the COVID crisis, gotten much bigger. They've expanded their wealth over the COVID crisis by $1 trillion. And you think, wow, that is horrible that these evil capitalists are just making so much money when everyone else is suffering. And that's the way it is constantly being framed. And that's actually a complete misunderstanding of what actually happened. Yes, they made lots of money, but it wasn't capitalism that helped them make that money. It was actually the very opposite of capitalism that helped them to make the money that they made. And really, what happened was you had a situation where the government, through socialism, basically, where the COVID crisis was basically a socialist coup in my mind, that people's freedoms have been taken. We've been basically caged as humans. We're not allowed to go out. We're not allowed to act like humans. We're in a situation where the government is in control. It's a socialist coup. And during a socialist coup, what you have is you have the destruction of capitalism, where small businesses, who are like a bunch of companies all competing, and really the inspiration for capitalism, this constant competition, where they will constantly have to fight to get the best pricing, to treat their employees the best, to do all these things to be the best business that they can in order to be successful. You have that whole thing being sort of tossed aside, while the government basically says, well, we're not going to allow those small businesses to run. They're all going to have to like sort of wait while we deal with this pandemic. And what ends up happening is they say, well, you still need to go shopping and you still need to buy stuff. We know that. So we'll let you buy things from Walmart or Amazon. And you can't buy from your local small mom and pop store anymore. So what ends up happening is the government has chosen who is the winners and who is the losers. So that concentration of power that Dr. Wolf is going to complain about is really just the implementation of government socialism, where the government is basically getting rid of the free market in favor of some kind of government control where they choose who the winners are in business. And it's a real problem that seems to reoccur. And you'll notice, like, if you look at the stock market crash, if you look at all these crashes that we've seen over the years, you can always sort of go back and say, hey, look, was it really a failure of capitalism, or was it a failure of government getting involved in messing up capitalism? So the two things are very linked, and Dr. Wolf really doesn't understand how governments are the ones that are causing the problems with capitalism. So let's watch some more here.
You can't do that within the framework of the system. You have to face the fact that the system itself is the problem, which is why Marxists tend to be people who abide by the idea we can and we should do better than capitalism. We should reorganize society because that will be a better way to deal with all those problems than dealing with them individually as if you could solve homelessness or solve inequality by a quick fix, by a marginal adjustment. No, the problems are systemic. So you have to understand how capitalism as a system works in order to begin to work your way to a solution.
Can you give a brief explanation of dialect?
Okay, just before she gets into the dialectic materialism, what you have to understand is what he just said there. Marxism really takes the concept of, and she's going to get into it in a second with this dialectic materialism, but it really takes the concept of having a system that is totally flawed. So Marxists see that the capitalist system is 100% flawed and needs to be just ripped apart, stripped down, gotten rid of. And basically, what they're trying to do is within the Marxist society is basically get rid of all forms of capitalism. Capitalism is evil to the core. Get rid of it. Start something new. And that's really the whole concept of a lot of this socialism that we see. They have a tendency of saying, get rid of it all, and you know and often they don't really have a replacement. That's one of the big problems with socialism. But they really see that if you just get rid of, somehow, if you magically get rid of capitalism, that all of a sudden the world will be a happy, perfect place where everybody's equal and everybody's holding hands and singing kumbaya. Well, it doesn't work that way. But that's generally the standpoint that they're coming from, that they want to tear down the system. And that's really important to understand, just as something to understand.
Practical materialism.
Marx was a philosopher, so being a rigorous and systematic thinker, he didn't want to jump into economics, which is what he focused on, without grounding it in philosophy. So he begins as a student of Hegel, the great philosopher. When he begins his academic life, Marx began as a professor. He taught philosophy. His doctoral dissertation was on ancient Greek philosophy. He wasn't an economist when he began. He ended up thinking he had to study economics because of how philosophy got him there. And to be quick in a way, he comes out of a school of thought that believed that ideas were the supreme achievement of human beings. Ideas are what you get from the most refined reflection that the human brain can do. If you're religiously oriented, ideas are what you get from God, from the spiritual realm. And so the world is really shaped by something prior to the world, namely ideas. So the notion is, sometimes called idealism, that the real world is the product of ideas. And if you want to really understand the real world, go to the ideas that make it what it is. Religiously, in the beginning, there was nothing. And there was first God, which is a non-material idea, and that creates the world. Remember, in Genesis, 7 days, God, a spirituality, creates the materiality of the world. Marx rejected that. For him, the material is just as important as the ideal. If you want to see where the material comes from, it's shaped by ideas. But, and here comes his radicalism, it runs the other way too. The ideas don't come from nowhere. They come out of the real world. The ideas we have as people have to do with the real material problems we have as human beings and how we solve them. Where do we get our food? Where do we get our shelter? How do we get protection as little children from the elements, from our parents? All of these real material matters of life and survival are shaping our ideas every bit as much as our ideas shape the reality. Dialectical materialism is the name for a point of view that says if you want to understand the world, you need to look at how ideas shape the material, but the other way too, and the two have interact. That's the way to see the world. And for that reason, when it came to explaining the problems of capitalism, he never could and never did suggest it's all because of the ideas of people about capitalism. It's the real way human beings make their food, solve their clothing.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop him there, because I feel like his explanation isn't really doing a very good explanation of Marx's thought. Um, I'm going to explain what I believe Marx was trying to say with the dialectic materialism. I actually think his explanation is interesting. It's looking at more the materialism part of the dialectic materialism. Um, One of the things that Hegel came up with was the concept of the like the two sides of a coin. And what happens is you have like a thesis and an antithesis. And what happens is, for example, feudalism could be the thesis, which is sort of the accepted idea of society. And that accepted idea is how the society runs. So it's a feudalist society. There's kings, there's lords, there's peasants. And what happens is whenever you have a thesis within the world, you have its opposite being naturally created. And that antithesis is that there's this bourgeoisie, the capitalist system, that basically says we don't need kings, we don't need lords, we just need people to produce stuff and have a system. Okay, so that's the antithesis. Is something that's opposite to the way the system currently works. And then what happens is you those two forces combined. Okay, they sort of battle each other, and you get what's called a synthesis. And this is what happens is then a new society is created, maybe which is closer to what the antithesis is. So in the case of capitalism, you get from feudalism, you go to capitalism, and then the antithesis of capitalism is created, which is the workers and some socialist movement. And then what happens is those two forces fight out, and then you get the socialists, becoming the new thesis, and that's when you get communism and so forth. And that's what Marx called dialectic materialism, that you get this kind of dialectic, which is two ideas, and it moves forward through the natural order of things, and you get this movement towards a socialist paradise. So that's kind of the way to explain it. And what he said about the ideas is probably fairly accurate in terms of the way Marx kind of presented it. But the point really is that there's this competition that's happening between two sides, which are opposites, and then they fight, and then there's a synthesis that is born. Now, the mistake that is actually made within that one argument that Marx presents is that what really happens isn't that one system kills the other system. So if you look at just even with capitalism versus feudalism, there was sort of what happened was the two systems did battle it out. The capitalist system was growing, and it was kind of undermining the feudalist system. And what ended up happening was you get sort of a synthesis forming that was a combination of the two. For example, Marx was really referring to England a lot. And in England, what you had is the forming of the parliamentary system, where you have representation of the people, and you have a capitalist system, but you still have some of the feudal elements remaining. They still have the lords, they still have the queen, they still have some of that feudalist system within this new synthesis that is formed. And even in societies that go socialist, you'll see that same kind of thing where if you look at China, China is a good thing to look at, because you say, well, they went full on socialist, full on communist, and what they found was that it was falling apart. It just wasn't able to stand up. Socialism just doesn't work. And what they had to do was bring back some of the capitalist system. And once they did that, they had more of something that was a working model. And I still think that their society has a lot of way to go, where they're going to embrace capitalism even more. Depending on the government right now, I think the current Chinese government does want to kind of go back to maybe old school communism, but for the most part, capitalism has some roots in China, and it is not a synthesis that is pure socialism. It has some of these, as I said, capitalist roots, and that's very different than what Marx would have proposed would happen. So that's one of the mistakes that Marx makes, that there's this dialectic materialism that flows a certain way, and it doesn't necessarily always flow that way. History isn't so convenient that it just sort of works out that way. And that's one of the mistakes that we have to understand with Marx, that his theories didn't actually work in the real world. Um, and the basis for his theories didn't work in the real world. So the problem often, as a capitalist person myself, and I'm trying to argue with socialists, is they'll try to bring you into that socialist framing. And that is a real challenge because you can't argue within a system, within a framework that isn't like practical or something that is relatable to the real world. So you're always in this constant state of like, well, no, you can't think of it that way because it just doesn't work that way. And if you try to like argue with them, it's like, well, Marx says it and it must be real. You can't assume what Marx is saying is real, and it doesn't work that way. There's just things aren't the way that Marx puts them forward. There's like so much. Like I did videos on the labor value theory of labor, and it's just bad ideas, and you trying to use that as a framework to argue. It's like so annoying because it's like arguing about imaginary things. It's impossible to really win an argument because whenever you try to bring in real concepts, well, the imaginary world, you can just be as crazy as you want. So it's really hard to have a legitimate conversation with the socialists because they're always living in this imaginary world where things work some weird way, and it's really hard to kind of combat those kind of arguments because there's just no realness to it. That's why I'm really against this whole postmodernist way of thinking, because in postmodernism you get this situation where you have philosophy that there is no truth, that truth is subjective, and that everybody has their own truth. Well, if everybody has their own truth, then it's really hard to argue with somebody that believes something that is completely different than what you believe, even though what you believe could be factual. If they believe that the sky is green and you say, no, 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 it's blue. Well, they say, well, no, I believe it's green, and, it is that. So this is one of the problems that you have. You can't argue with somebody that isn't living in the real world, isn't thinking with realistic understandings of what is actually happening. They're living in a fantasy world. And often that's the case with socialists. They're living in that fantasy world, and it's impossible to argue with them. So that's just something I really always wanted to say, and I just wanted to make that clear. I'm going to play more of his video and comment further.
Problems, their relationship problems that shape their ideas as much, and he was going to analyze capitalism through that lens of the interaction of ideas and concrete material reality back and forth.
Marxists take a particular view of history called historical materialism. How is the current area of capitalism fit into the long history? I think you've mentioned this before, just how this is just the latest chapter in a long history of economic development.
The basic idea is that every economic system has in it conflicting forces. The language in Marxism is internal contradictions. The system has in it problems it is constantly struggling with because they're built into the system, and for long periods of time it finds solutions. But in the end, historical materialism says, the internal contradictions become unmanageable, and then there's a kind of explosion, the system dies, and a new one is born. So we had slavery, for example, in various parts of the world. It was born, it evolved, it had its contradictions. For example, the contradiction that the only way a slave system can continue is if you replace the slaves that reach old age and die, and that's become a big problem for many slave societies. And so eventually, the slavery couldn't solve its problems, and it died, replaced by feudalism in Europe, which went through the parallel process, and then it blew up. It couldn't solve its problems. So historical materialism begins to look at capitalism through the same lens. What are the internal contradictions? how do they bedevil the system? What solutions for a while have they found? But when and where might we get to a level of internal contradiction that makes the system tremble, makes it vulnerable? And at that point, if revolutionaries can see and understand what's going on, they can intervene to move to the next system, to get beyond this. Just like rebels.
Okay, so basically he's saying the same stuff that I was saying, that there's, but I like the way he's saying it, that there's this internal conflict that needs to be resolved. Um, I kind of hinted at that. I kind of should have said that a little bit more like succinctly, that there is, what Marx did see is that there's this internal conflict, as I said, between the synthesis and the thesis, antithesis and the thesis, I should say. Um, and what happens is they kind of things fall apart because they just are in such conflict. Um, so yeah, so I agree with all that as an interpretation of Marx. And he's basically saying the same stuff that I am. I just gave you the sort of my opinion of why it doesn't necessarily work that way. Um, so I'll keep on playing. He's going to get into the concept, I think, based on what I'm gathering from what he's saying, that that there's this movement that's required. If you notice, Marxists and like, I'm going to give you a few examples of Marxists. BLM is a good Marxist organization. Uh, there's like a bunch of these Marxist organizations like Antifa and these kind of things. If you notice the kind of the way that they behave, it's very activist. They go out, they protest, they burn things down. They as I said, Marxists have a tendency of wanting to destroy things, like rip down the system so that something new can be rebuilt. So there's that activist element that really needs to be understood behind Marxist followers, like that these are people that really want to cause change, to basically speed up that process of this internal conflict that they see and push it so that their side gets, to the top. And that there's this movement that will result in the socialist utopia that they all dream about. And you gotta, if you can just ignite that flame, then all this will happen. And that's really what they believe. So you'll notice that kind of language within any of the Marxist doctrine. It's that whole workers unite, that the fist, that where they really believe that it's a active movement where there will be bloodshed, there will be like some kind of tearing down of society, and that's part of the danger of Marxism. You get situations like the Khmer Rouge where they slaughtered like 1/4 of their population because they have to tear down not just the buildings, not just the structures, the systems, and all this kind of stuff. They have to tear down the people themselves. And that is the danger. There's always a slaughter that is associated with socialism because they have to wipe out any traces of the old system. To remove that contradictions, the conflicts that happen, they have to rip apart and destroy anything that resembles that old thing that they're trying to get rid of. In this case, capitalism. So it's very important to understand this. This is the danger of socialism. This is why socialist revolutions are very bloody, and a lot of people get killed and a lot of people get exiled. If you look at like Cuba is another good example. People die and people will get exiled.
Overthrew slavery, rebels overthrew feudalism. The expectation of Marx was that capitalism would generate the contradictions, then the tensions, then the failed solutions that would then bring into being the rebels with the ideas of criticism, Marx himself being one of those, who would eventually move to the next system. To illustrate it as concretely as I can, let me give you an example of the kind of contradiction Marx found in capitalism that has been crucial for everybody else. And I pick it because it's so relevant right now in the United States and around the world. Every capitalist, I think most of the folks watching know this just from their personal life, every capitalist is always trying to either make more money or survive competitively by saving on his labor costs. One capitalist does it by substituting machines for working people, automating, getting a computer to do what he used to have 50 people do, etc., etc. Another capitalist does it by trying to get cheaper workers in place of more expensive ones, hiring women, if they're less expensive, to do the job that they used to pay men more for, hiring immigrants rather than native folks, moving to another part of the world where wages are much lower. We all know that. So capitalists are always trying to save on labor costs because they can make a better profit if they do that. But here comes the contradiction. If all capitalists are reducing the number of workers they pay or reducing the pay they give to their workers, what will result is that the working people have less and less money. And if they have less and less money, they can't buy what the capitalists are producing to sell. The capitalists, therefore, are destroying themselves, but they have no choice. They have to save on the labor outlay, and then that comes back and bites them in the rear end because there's no demand. If you've been so successful becoming rich as a capitalist, you've killed yourself. These kinds of
Okay, so wow. Okay, so this is one of those misconceptions about capitalism that happens all the time. It drives me crazy. When are socialists going to live in the real world? So a good concept to understand is minimum wage. And the funny thing is 99%, I think it's like 95 or higher percentage of people really don't live on minimum wage. Nobody, like most employees don't get minimum wage. But you'd be like, well, why not pay everyone minimum wage? If, or even lower if you could. Well, the reason capitalists don't pay their employees below minimum wage or minimum wage as a bare minimum um, is due to the fact that there's a competition that's happening for labor. And this is what happens. Like um, a story that I tell in many of my videos is I hired somebody from India because the work that I had, I couldn't hire somebody locally because minimum wage was like $10 an hour at the time. And the work that I needed done was worth maybe $1 or $2. Okay. It was work that really there wasn't much demand. Like it was like something very low level work that I couldn't pay more than $2 for it. It was just the lowest level of work. And the reason I couldn't pay that was any more than that was the type of people that I would hire to do that work were usually brand new to doing that work. Now, if they got better at it, I could pay them more. And so what happened was I have had the situation where the minimum wage hasn't really changed that much. It's maybe, I think it's $14 now in Canada. Um, and but that worker that I hired to do that same simple task work, they got better at it and they've improved over the years. Now I pay them $12 an hour. So they almost pay almost what somebody would make in Canada to do the same work because they can do more of it. They're a little bit more efficient, and the amount of value that I see from that work is much higher. So therefore, I can justify that price. And if I didn't pay them that much, they would leave me and I would have to be like, oh, I got to train somebody, go through the whole process again and find somebody to do that work. And it can be really annoying going through that whole learning curve with a new employee. So what happens is you end up paying your employee more over time. And it's just the way capitalism works. That actually what ends up happening is within a capitalist structure, you end up paying people more and more for the same labor. And it's just, things change. Uh, and within a socialist system, the funny thing is the actual opposite happens. So within a socialist system, they have a tendency of creating these systems where the workers actually get paid less and less, because what happens within a socialist system is it's all dependent on the government. And since the government isn't a producer of the economy, it's not building the economy in any particular way. What it does is it it runs out of money, and once it runs out of money, it starts trying to find ways around, paying people, basically. So it pays people the minimum, and they say, well, we can't pay you anymore because we just don't have the money to pay people. So this is the most that we can pay people. And what ends up happening is they just start paying people less and less as they become as the government runs out of the money that it has. And this is what you see in Venezuela. If you look at every socialist society, they start out and it's like, it looks like a miracle. It looks like a miracle. Whenever there's a socialist system, it's like a 5-year miracle. And the reason I call it a 5-year miracle is, if you look at Russia, for example, Russia was like so primitive, and it was backward. It was like a feudalist system. It was so far behind. And then they brought in socialism, and there was this miracle where it looked like it was really turning around. You had factories being built. You had all this new stuff being developed, and there was a real excitement. So what happened was all of that was being funded by the money that they had gotten from killing the czar, from killing all the royals, killing as many of these people that had money, so that they can use that money to pay for the system. But that money eventually ran out, and what happened is you get a situation where once the money runs out, the miracle is over, and things start falling apart. So, like, a lot of these communist societies do really, really well at the beginning, and then the money runs out, and then things go really bad. The same happened in Venezuela. In Venezuela, they had the best education for all the people. They had all these wonderful things at the beginning because the government was paying for it all with stolen money. Well, once that stolen money runs out and there's no new innovative people to produce new wealth, what ends up happening is you run out of money and everybody starts starving. And that's the problem with socialism. With capitalism, there's always new money being created. There's always new wealth being created. And that new wealth, even if it doesn't get distributed evenly, it still gets kind of trickled down into the society. And what ends up happening is people get lifted out of poverty. They pay their employees more. They pay, everyone does a little bit better. And it's just the difference between socialism versus capitalism. And it drives me crazy whenever I hear one of these socialists speak, where they always talk about, oh, the evil capitalists must constantly squeeze their employees to pay them less and less and less. And they basically make them starve. All these poor employees are starving everywhere in a capitalist system. Well, that's not the case. Look at every capitalist system. The people are always better off. And they're not just better off for a short term, like socialism does. They're better off for the long term. And it drives me crazy to hear these kind of socialist people saying this kind of crap that just isn't true. It's just not based on reality. And, people gobble it up because they love saying, oh, those evil capitalists. Well, it's just not true. It's just frankly not true.
Contradictions for Marx are the beginning of the end of a system. It papers it over. For example, when people couldn't buy in the 1970s, the capitalist system kept going anyway. How did it do that? How did it keep going when the people didn't have enough money from their wages to buy? The solution was credit. We loaded the world up. House credit, that's your mortgage. Car payment credit, nobody buys a car except by paying out. Credit cards, which didn't exist before the 1970s for anything but traveling businessmen, and only a small number of them. And then when that was not enough, we loaded up, for the first time in American history, an entire generation of students who can't get a degree without loading up with tens of thousands of dollars of debt. We kept the system going. People could buy stuff even though their wages didn't pay for it by borrowing. And in 2008, the predictable happened. It turned out your fix only lasts for a while. You really have to ask, in a way that many of us as Marxists haven't done for most of our lives. The problems of capitalism now are so severe, so systemic, so global, that we're beginning to wonder whether this system is going to find a way out. The Marxists are not the only ones wondering whether this system is coming to an end. The people on the other side of the political fence are very worried too.
Yeah, you have billionaires writing op-eds. The
Absolutely.
pitchforks are coming for the plutocrats because they know what's coming. Let's talk about the bubbles.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. Wow. Okay. So basically, they talk about how the capitalist system has led to the debt crisis, and the debt crisis. The 2008 debt crisis is a really big misunderstanding of capitalism because it has nothing to do with capitalism. It does have to do with big government. Basically, what happened in 2008 was the banks, who are very savvy, they're very, very savvy. Banks want to make money. They're capitalists. They're the pinnacle of capitalists. They want to make money. So what they do is they loan to people who can pay them back. Very simple. If I loan you $10 and I know that I'm going to get $11 back, I'm happy. But if I lend you $10 and I know you're never going to give me back my, I'm not going to loan money to you because you're deadbeat. However, what happened in 2008 was the government said, okay, we know that this guy's not going to pay you back that $10. But can you just loan him the money anyways? Please, please. And if he doesn't pay you back, we'll give you the $10. Don't worry. And that's what they did. And they did that through Fannie Mae and Bernie Mac. And basically what they did was they secured the loans for the banks. So the banks were now incentivized to basically loan to anybody. Because if they know that there is no risk, the more loans that they can make, if there's any success, then, if that guy that might not pay you back pays you back, well, then that's a win. And, and if he doesn't pay you back, well, the government steps in anyways. So you win-win no matter what you do. So they were just going out and loaning money to everybody. But that's not capitalism. Capitalists would never do that. Capitalists would say, well, no, I'm not going to risk my money. I'm going to, only lend money to people that can pay me back. But governments don't think that way. That's the problem with socialism. Governments say, well, everybody's equal. Everybody should be able to get a loan. Well, it doesn't work that way. Not everybody deserves a loan. And that's something that this Dr. Wolf doesn't understand. He doesn't understand that the failure of 2008 was not a failure of capitalism, but it was a real failure of government intervention and government socialism. So if anyone should be blamed for the 2008 crisis, it should be the government. So I hate the fact that they try to blame capitalism for these crashes that constantly happen, because what ends up happening, and this is the truth about capitalism in general, capitalism is utterly successful. It's so successful that it makes people say, well, maybe we should help others. And the way we have to do this is through the government. And if we get more government to help others, then maybe everybody will get helped. Okay? And so what ends up happening is you start getting this government involvement within capitalism, and that breaks down the system. The same thing happened in the 20s. And even earlier than that, every crisis was government involved, where they did something, where they put in stupid policies, and it just destroys the system. It's frustrating to hear over and over again, they blame capitalism for the failures of big government. So yeah, that was just an aside. Now we're going to get into, they're going to talk about the bubbles. Now, as I said, there's really two themes that Dr. Wolf constantly goes on about, and those are this kind of bubble crisis of capitalism where they, things, seem to get big and then they pop and it all falls apart. And that does happen. Actually, that does happen within capitalism. Capitalism is a creative and destructive force. Uh, but if you're a true capitalist, you actually see the beauty in both sides of that. The destruction that happens within capitalism can be quite beautiful. And I'll give you a quick example because I know I'm going on a bit of a tangent here. But one of the things that you can say, okay, here's a way that capitalism is very destructive. Capitalism is very good at being innovative, pushing new ideas, because if you can come up with some new idea, some new thing that nobody's thought about before, you can make a lot of money. And you can come up with something that really drives the market a certain way. And that's very exciting because you can make so much money, and a good example of that was the newspapers. Uh, when newspapers were huge at one time. And then there was this new thing called the internet, and people were starting to put information online. They could share as much information they want. They could be more timely. It was very quick to publish something on the internet, and you could syndicate it out to the world very quickly. And the old newspaper was like, well, hey, we can't compete against that. We have to print all the stuff. We have to, curate the content. It takes a while to build it all up. And then, it takes this, we publish it the next day. And, it was just impossible for them to compete. They were out of date. They were, they were publishing only to a specific area, as many newspapers as they could print. And there was like so many costs associated with that kind of distribution that there was no way to compete against the internet, where they could just almost publish it for free. It was almost free as when you put something on the internet. And so, it was uncompetitive. It was just, there's no way it would survive. So you have these big publishing companies going out of business. And that's the destructive nature of capitalism. But at the same point, there's a beauty there, because what happens is you get these new innovations that make life better for everyone. The internet is brilliant in terms of getting out information, in terms of getting new ideas to more and more people. And that is huge. And you can't deny the value that is there. And the result of that value is that most people now can earn incomes from the internet. There's like so much business that can be done through the internet that it's actually much bigger than the thing that it killed. And that's the beauty of the destructive nature of capitalism, that sometimes what happens is something gets destroyed, which was amazing in itself, but is replaced with something that's way better and actually helps more people. So that's kind of the beautiful destructive nature of capitalism. And let's let them talk about it on the way they're going to see it as negative, but we'll listen to them now.
You're talking about the housing bubble, and I think that this is a really interesting indication, the housing crisis, the crisis of overproduction, the fact that we have more houses than we do homeless people. But because you had this crisis of overproduction, too much of something was produced and people couldn't utilize it. I mean, talk about that concept and why this is an inescapable phenomenon under capitalism.
Starting in the 1970s, American businesses began to have what I like to call a eureka moment. They realized that in the West, North America, Western Europe, and Japan, 100 and 200 years of capitalism had built up impressive factories, offices, stores. But they were built up in the places where capitalism was born, Western Europe, North America, and Japan. That's where they had concentrated everything. And that's where they had drawn workers in off the countryside to become urban, industrialized, working classes. And along the way, the workers, noticing how productive capitalism was since they did the work, demanded for themselves a rising standard of living. So roughly, From 1820 to 1970, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere, wages rose. That's what, over that time, capitalists were doing so well, they could raise the wages of their workers and still make out like bandits. So it was a system in which people began to get the idea capitalism works. It delivers the goods because it raises wages. You had to not look at what was happening to where most people in the world lived, Asia, Africa, Latin America, because for them the situation was horrible. But if you concentrated on where capitalism was born, you could fool yourself into thinking, wow, this is a system that works. And the capitalists, of course, and the people who liked it celebrated all of that.
Wait. That was like so crazy. So he's basically saying that in the places where they had capitalism, they see all this success and wealth and growth and prosperity, and they could pay their employees more. He actually said that, which is contradictory to everything he said earlier. It's just so crazy. My mind is being blown right now by how crazy what he just said, what he said was. So all this stuff he's saying, well, capitalism, was very successful in these few little places. Well, what he doesn't acknowledge is that in those other places in Africa and most of Asia at that time during the 70s or earlier, there was no capitalism. They were either feudal or there were a lot of socialist societies, actually, especially in Africa. Africa is so messed up. And there's very tribal societies there as well. And they have a real problem with kind of these dictatorships that are kind of socialist dictatorships. They're not capitalist at all. So why are you saying that, oh, you have to look at those places like that are still suffering? Well, those places are suffering because they haven't embraced capitalism. Any country, if you take some country that doesn't have historical connection to capitalism and you bring in capitalism, what you'll see is that country will actually prosper. And I just made the example before about China, about how China prospered when it brought in just a little bit of capitalism. It has no historical connection to capitalism, but yet when you bring it in, it does well. So this is just like it just kills my brain to hear this kind of stupidity and demonize capitalism in the same sentence when he really should be demonizing the very societies that aren't performing well and that are really the sources of the problems in the world, which are these socialist dictator-run countries. So yeah, just craziness. I'll let him speak some more. And then I'll probably have to do this as a two-part video because I realize that I'm talking a lot and it's going to be a very long video. So I'm going to probably make this a two-part one and I'll let him finish this thought and then I'll comment on it and summarize and then I'll probably make a part two.
Then in the 1970s, capitalists had this eureka moment. They said to themselves, wait a minute, we're in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, where the wages are now very high. Workers are very happy. But why are we here? In the rest of the world, which has been savaged by the growth of capitalism in those privileged areas, wages are very low. So in this eureka moment, capitalists said, what are we doing here in the Western Europe, North America, and Japan? It's much more profitable if we produce in China, in India, in Brazil, anywhere else. And there begins what we're still in the middle of, the exodus, the abandonment of the places of origin of capitalism by the capitalists. So there's a massive move to China, India, Brazil, and all those places, producing what? Well, what every capitalist wants, which is to make a bundle. So they build big factories, imagining that they can sell all of this stuff like they used to. But they forgot something. If you go from high wages in the United States to low wages in China, the bottom line is that the people earning wages are earning a lot less than they used to. It's not just that they're not Americans, they're Chinese, but they can't buy back what you're building. They can't manage to consume what you have the capacity to produce. Right now, China is slowing down, scaring the whole world. But it's not China that's slowing down. It's the inability of China to sell to the world because the wages of the world's workers have been depressed now for years as we move out of Western Europe, North America, and Japan into these lower. And the system totters as it encounters a very old contradiction in its current form for which they have no solution.
Okay, that's a good place to stop. What he said is total BS. It's just total BS. Sorry. Um, what you actually had, and the reason a lot of these businesses, this eureka moment that he's talking about, and this is something that they always say, well, oh, these companies, they shifted their labor from North America to Asia to Africa, wherever they could find cheaper labor. And that's a typical way of thinking that a lot of socialists think, that if we just move, um, these capitalists want to just pay their employees as little as possible. If they could pay their employees nothing, they would. They're just evil people that want to just squeeze every dime. They want slaves, basically. These capitalists, they're so evil. That's the way that they think. Well, that's not how capitalists work. The reason capitalists moved from North America and hiring North American people to hiring people in China was government policies. So what happened was you have in the rise of the union. And the union I see as a form of government. And basically what happened was unions were saying, well, we want higher and higher wages that were outstripping how much that labor was actually worth. So if I have to pay my employee $20 to do something that is only worth $10, well, there's just no way I can run my business that way. I have to pay them based on what they produce. And what was happening was you get the situation where the governments, these unions, were basically asking for more and more, and it was making it impossible for businesses to run. So they said, well, we can't afford to hire people locally anymore because you've made it impossible. You've raised this minimum wage. You've done all these things that make it really impossible for businesses to run. You raise taxes. You have all these things that basically get in the way. Regulations are horrible, and you can. So as a business owner, you say, well, where can I go where there's less regulations, less rules about minimum wage, like I can pay my employees less, and less have hassles of dealing with unions that always are complaining or going on strike and causing work problems. Well, I'll go to places where they don't have such strict rules, that don't have so much government interference. And that's what happened. They moved their factories overseas. And any logical person would have done the same thing. It wasn't that they really wanted to do that. A good example of this is the Apple iPhone. A lot of people think that the Apple iPhone is mostly put together in China. But most of what goes into an iPhone actually comes out of Germany. Germany is the biggest contributor to that iPhone. These iPhones are really a product of the world where all the components are being kind of brought from a whole bunch of different places. And what happens is you get this situation where certain countries will produce different parts or components of this iPhone. And then what usually happens is all these components get kind of put into a box or something, and then they get shipped over to China. And then in China, they actually assemble the thing together, and then they ship it back to here. So what happens is most of the work that actually goes into an iPhone happens in Germany. Some of the highest labor costs, but they also have the highest skill labor. So what happens is you can justify those high costs because the labor is skilled enough to justify that cost. Another thing that was kind of interesting was when the car companies shifted from Detroit to Mexico, where they started producing cars in Mexico. You saw the same kind of thing happening, where all of a sudden the labor that was lost in the U.S. and really resourced in Mexico, the cost that they actually paid the employees really didn't change much. They actually, at first, they paid the Mexicans very little because they were unskilled. But once they got skilled and were able to produce things better, they actually paid them almost as much as what they were paying their American counterparts. So you wonder, why would they do that? Why would they pay this third world country um, as much as they would pay somebody locally? Well, the reason, it's not the labor that's the biggest expense for these companies. It's the regulations. It's all these problems that the government and unions present that really make too many costs that really prevent the business from using local labor. So it's just, it's cheaper to produce still in Mexico, even though the labor cost might be similar. So this is one of those misconceptions that really people don't understand about capitalism, and they don't understand why capitalists will outsource. I outsource. I'm a good example of this. Like, if I could get people locally to, come on board for $1 an hour, because I feel like the work is only worth $1 an hour when they're first starting and they don't know what they're doing. But over time, I can pay them more, because if they get good at it, then I can justify that cost. But, if I have to pay them $15 an hour right at the beginning, well, I can't justify that. It just doesn't make sense. So when you have these kind of crazy rules that prevent you from actually making business work, then ends up happening that you have to outsource. And I'm not a big fan of outsourcing, but it's where I have to actually, for my own business, I have to outsource. I have about 20 employees overseas where they do work for me, and I do it because the costs are lower. But I'm actually always giving them raises because of the fact that I'm competing to maintain those those employees. And what ends up happening is, you see, as capitalists shifted from being North America or European based to other places, there's been a real rise in the wealth of these other countries. So as capitalism gets its roots sort of in the ground in these other countries, what you see is sort of a rise of all the people in those countries. So after a while, India is actually fairly expensive to get employees from now. Philippines is actually getting a bit more expensive too. And all these countries are just, their wages are going up as capitalism gets stronger in those nations. So this is one of those big misconceptions that they have about capitalism. Um, I'll have to do a part two because he's got another 20 minutes of talking, and I've talked a lot too. So I hope you enjoyed this first part of a two-part series where I look at Marxism 101, How Capitalism is Killing Itself, with Richard Wolff. So look forward to part two. I'll try to put it out tomorrow. And I hope you enjoyed this first part. Please comment below. And if you think that I've said something that's not true, please tell me. Thanks for watching. Bye.